Let me start this session of the Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag Series. I'm Bob Kiter, Director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. This session is one in a series of 4 talks that we've had addressing Utah water law policy and management. Before we get into the program, let me just extend our welcome to everyone joining us online today. We had originally intended to also provide an in-person option, but by virtue of the weather conditions and travel requirements for our speaker, we decided to move to this virtual option. We're very pleased to have you aboard virtually today. To begin, given the university's location with our native lands acknowledgement, we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. And we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. As I mentioned, today's talk is the 4th in our series on Utah water law policy and management. We'll be addressing the topic of considering wildlife in water management today. We previously had talks on basic Utah water law, on the Colorado River and its intersection with Utah and Colorado River law and policy. 2 weeks ago, we heard about the challenges of measuring water use in the state of Utah and different methods that have been used over time to address that. And again, today's session addresses wildlife. If you missed these earlier presentations, they are available online at the S.J. Quinney College of Law YouTube channel. I should also note that we intended this series to be something of a lead-in to the 28th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium, which this year addresses the future of the Great Salt Lake. The symposium will occur in a couple of weeks on March 16th and 17th. In person and virtually here at the law school on the 6th floor in person. And registration is open and available on the Wallace Stegner website. I should also mention a couple of upcoming programs. For the Stegner Center on March 27th, we will host Natalie Koch, who's the author of Arid Empires, the Entangled Fates of Arizona and Arabia, addressing some of the similarities and overlapping challenges that the state and the nation of Saudi Arabia address with respect to aridity and water. On April 6th, we'll hear from Andrew Guilford, professor of history and environmental studies at Fort Lewis College, who will be speaking on his newly published book, Bears Ears, Landscape of Refuge and Resistance. And then on April 11th, we will hear from Ann Palmer, who will address material that she found and has curated respecting correspondence written by and with the young Wallace Stegner, the namesake of the Wallace Stegner Center. I should also mention that in conjunction with several other programs here at the University of Utah. On, I believe it's March or April 12th, we will host in the moot court room one of the early screenings of a documentary that's just being released on Stuart Udall, Secretary of the Interior during the 1960s, with under both President Kennedy and President Johnson. I've had the opportunity to preview the film, and it's quite a heartwarming and insightful look at Stuart Udall's life and his many contributions to our national life, and including conservation and, interestingly enough, race relations. Today, we will address considering wildlife in water management. We're joined by Yvette Converse, who is currently the Chief of Science and Resources for Grand Teton National Park. She previously, up until literally a month ago, served as the field supervisor for the Utah Ecological Services Field Office of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, hence her familiarity with water policy, wildlife and fish management here in the state of Utah. In that capacity, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, she oversaw regulatory wildlife work, primarily through the Endangered Species Act. She was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 20 years, both in Utah and Montana. Her approach to resource management is based in community conservation and the promotion of local stewardship and collaboration at the landscape scale, working with both federal, state, county, tribal, and non-governmental and industry partners. Yvette moved west from central Pennsylvania after attending Franklin and Marshall College, where she majored in biology and art. Since arriving in Salt Lake City, where she began her federal career with the U.S. Forest Service. She advises that she was on the crew that built the first boardwalk at Silver Lake and Big Cottonwood Canyon, and also served on the Logan Hotshot firefighting crew during the early 1990s. Since moving to Utah, she's earned a Master's of Science in Aquatic Ecology from Utah State University. And early in her career, she also worked with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources as an aquatic biologist for the state, and also with BioWest before shifting to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Before we start, let me also extend Stegner Center's thanks and appreciation to the National Audubon Society for their financial support of this series on Utah water law and policy. And let me also note that if members of our audience have questions, you can make use of the Q&A function that's found at the bottom of your screen, and I will in turn, once we're through, feed the questions to Yvette. And with that, let me again thank Yvette for joining us, and let me turn the program and the screen over to you. Thanks again.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to get started here. I appreciate being here, and apologies that I can't be there in person. I wanted to make a couple comments to start. These topics are big topics. People teach classes on them, write books about them, so we're not going to be able to cover everything. I'm mainly drawing from my own experience and career in providing some examples of what I think might be relevant and salient for us in what the situations that we're dealing with now. And when I'm talking about wildlife here, I'll be talking about all forms of life and live organisms in the wild environment. So that's a very broad definition of wildlife, not just mammals, not just fish, basically including plants and the microbiota as well. So we'll get started. An overview of what I'm going to try to cover, ecological fundamentals, just really quickly to get us on the same page, talk a little bit about what we generally mean by water conservation. I'm going to touch on the state and federal laws and regulations and basically the nexus of how we manage to work on wildlife protection and water management. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into the Endangered Species Act only because, not because it is the tool, it's not, and it's not the only tool, nor is it necessarily the best or most useful tool, but I have some examples that I'm going to talk about that will help if we have that background. So I'm going to get started. Ecological fundamentals. All life requires water. Pretty basic. I think most of us know this, and this is because metabolic and cell function requires water. So this need for water means that the access to water drives life cycles of all living organisms because they require energy, which is a combination of sun, nutrients, and water. Pretty basic. As a result, plants and animals and all wild organisms live in, on, near, or move to water or extract it from their environment in some way. So that's all pretty basic. But one thing that we sometimes forget about when we're thinking about water is that it plays a major role in shaping the Earth's surface. And that means creating habitat. And that can be habitat aquatic, most acutely is what we think about, rivers running through, but also phenology, the greening up, so to speak, in seasonal changes. Utah's a water limited landscape. I think we all understand this, starting with the Mormon pioneers who immediately started to develop water so they could survive in Utah. And, pointed out by John Wesley Powell as he explored the Colorado. It's the second driest state and a fast growing state with some pretty extremes in precipitation and weather due to our unique topography. 95% of our water is from our snowpack. And so this means that our spring runoff, when that snowpack starts to melt, is very important. It's important to us as people because that's how we fill our reservoirs, and our reservoirs serve to help us distribute that water year round when we need it. It's also very important to wildlife that's adapted to the seasonality of a spring runoff event. That could be the physical water running off that, say, cueing fish to spawn. It could be related to temperatures of water, but it can also be, again, that greening up, that phenology. We know that wildlife populations like large ungulates follow phenology patterns across the landscape. So they sort of follow that greening up pattern, which is why they move up higher in the summer times. We also get water from monsoons. Those are important for wildlife that live in those environments where we have seasonal rains. And some spring and groundwater where there's less surface water is very important, like, say, spring snails. So what do we mean by water conservation? And I think this is important to talk about to kind of get the context and understand where some of our conflict comes from. In general, it's about protecting our water so that we can use it for what we want it for, making the most of the water we have. But for what purpose? If you ask the average person, why are you conserving water? They might say, because I want to continue to turn on my tap and get a drink of water or do what I need to do in agriculture or industry. If you ask someone who's working in the natural resource realm, they might say they're conserving water so they can keep it in a river system in order for it to protect those natural resources or natural processes like wildlife. If you talk to a water developer, water planner, or government planner, they might be thinking about water conservation more in terms of planning for water to have for future growth. Those three things aren't all the same, and they don't necessarily complement each other. So we've heard from previous lectures on this series that our consumptive use is the legal basis for our water rights in our water doctrine in the West. So that's municipal and industrial use, agricultural use for food, ranching, growing crops, and human, and that municipal and industrial use does support some urban wildlife, and agricultural use does support human tolerant wildlife, like, say, white-tailed deer or birds that move through, but it's limited, right? There are other uses as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those that we don't consider beneficial uses necessarily. And I think you've heard some about this in previous lectures, but I'm trying to explain this more in the context of wildlife. Water flows through natural rivers and streams. The purpose or the function, what it serves, is to recharge the groundwater. also to provide water for the natural environment, what we see and enjoy out there and use in terms of the natural environment. So this is very much in the spirit of wildlife uses and natural processes. But it's also important to remember that rivers can be a natural delivery mechanism. And I'll come back to that later in our discussion. Evaporation and transpiration often get lumped together. One's a biological process, one's a physical process, but it's basically water that's lost in delivery storage. So when we think about water balance, usually they're thrown together and they're considered as water that's lost as we're delivering or storing water. Transpiration is the uptake of water by plants. So that's obviously very important when it comes to wildlife. And this kind of water, this ET water, is what efficiency projects target. Return flows, this is water that already goes through the consumptive use, but is left over. So it's not all consumed. Some of it goes back into the system in some way. So water flushed, agricultural runoff, and then it finds its way either through engineered systems or through natural systems back to a river or some water body. And through that process, it supports riparian areas and wetlands. Also, again, helping with groundwater recharge that we know is important to future water use and to ongoing groundwater users. This is the water that is targeted by reuse projects. So these water efficiencies and this reuse systems that capture these waters, they're really important, and we're finding better ways to do this to make better use of our water, creating gains by improving our delivery and use. So it's things like lining canals and ditches, minimizing that evaporation and transpiration through pumps, pipes, and other engineering solutions to capture that unused water or wasted water. Reuse, again, it's already been through the consumptive use process. It's left over, it goes back into the streams. And now there's a lot of talk about taking that water that's coming back into the streams, pumping it back upstream, treating it, and reusing it again for various beneficial uses. That's, creates some complex plumbing problems and also is a big cost in energy. So all this fixing of our leaky plumbing is a good thing in a way from a conservation ethic if you're planning for future development or planning for ongoing uses, beneficial uses as they're defined by our laws. But what we're not thinking about is what is the cost of saving all of that water. That return flow supports riparian vegetation in trees, streams around canals, say, or groundwater recharge, and in general, the broad ecological benefits for wildlife that move to those water bodies. Also, recreational, mental well-being, and aesthetic benefits to us as humans. Okay, just a little bit about water use, and I'm just going to try to make a point here that most of you probably already realized, but the greatest use in Utah is agriculture. And of the 15% that's not agriculture, or it's somewhere around there, and those numbers change depending on where you're at in Utah, but about most of the municipal and industrial use is outdoor use. So the agriculture and outdoor use do create green spaces. They're not necessarily natural areas, wild areas, but they are green spaces. The figure on the upper right is actually groundwater, so it's not surface water. I couldn't find the equivalent for surface water, but what you're seeing here is that the increase in demand in water is basically coming from public water, not necessarily from agricultural industry. So the reason I bring this up is not about whether ag water is good or bad, not about industrial water being good or bad. These are things that we all take advantage of in our society and we use, and they're important. But we have to think about what happens when we're asking to make more efficient use of this water, what that means. We have to think about the fact that by changing our agricultural water use and making that more efficient, and our outdoor water use and making that more efficient, we're basically, unless we plan otherwise, planning to move green spaces into paved spaces. So state and federal law and regulations, just going to quickly go through this. And my intent here is not to cover the breadth of these. They're very complex, and you could probably do a lecture on each one of these bullets. But just to kind of give you an idea of the complexity, because there's no one way to manage water for wildlife. So under state water law, you've heard a lot about and read in the papers. They're doing a great job of covering what's going on with Great Salt Lake. And in particular, the state of Utah has had a law on the books since the mid 80s that division of wildlife could hold in-stream flows to benefit wildlife. It was very narrowly used and applied over the years. Tim Hawks and Director Joel Ferry, who's now Natural Resource Director of State of Utah, and others have been, and the legislature has been very involved in changing that to what it is today, House Bill 33, which was passed last year, that now allows us to convert in-stream flows that private entities own into beneficial uses for wildlife. The problem now becomes how to get that water to where we need it. For example, in the Great Salt Lake, how to get it downstream, because otherwise the next water user downstream has a right to that water. So just a quick example, I'm not going to talk about that more other than to say it's a significant step in the right direction with some additional significant challenges to overcome before we can really see that play out. And I do commend the folks that have worked on that and really appreciate the fact that the state is taking a lead in that. Also, state water law can support federal water rights for trust resources like federal land situations, and not in all cases, but sometimes the federal government will also represent tribal interests. There's new legislation that's being proposed and new ideas for how we're going to get water to Great Salt Lake that affect our state water law. And remains to be seen. Some of those are really good ideas, some of them not as good ideas, but it's great that we're thinking about these and trying to come together to figure that out. So water law can be changed and is changing. Water quality is a place, the laws around water quality is a place we don't really think about that in terms of managing water for wildlife, but it's very important. So the Clean Water Act, which is administered mainly by the EPA, and in Utah, that's delegated authority to Utah Division of Water Quality. Different sections of the Clean Water Act are administered differently by different entities, but basically this permitting process for runoff permits or the standards that are developed under Section 303 for impaired waters, or permits for Section 404 dredge and fill that the Army Corps of Engineers administers. These are all nexus for talking about how we can benefit and support wildlife or natural processes. Also, land resource, wildlife protection and management. There's some laws like Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, nothing specific to water. But what it does is create a situation where those laws intersect with a project like, say, Central Utah Project, that then allows us to do some really positive things for wildlife. So Central Utah Project was one of the big water projects in Utah, administered by the federal government, authorized by the federal government, funded by the federal government to develop water, and particularly to bring water from the Colorado over to the Wasatch Front, where most of the people were. And that was authorized in, I believe, the 50s, pretty much worked through the implementation into the 80s. The authorization ran out. It was reauthorized as the Central Utah Project Completion Act, CUPCA. And during that reauthorization in the 80s, they added mitigation. So mitigation for wildlife, mitigation for wetlands, recreation, and some other things. And the Utah Reclamation, Mitigation, and Conservation Commission administer and implement that even today with some fantastic staff. And they've really achieved some great things through that nexus, not just with Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but other state and federal laws. We also have land management, federal land management agencies, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, as well as federal agencies that administer water programs or water rights or water projects like Bureau of Reclamation, Army Corps of Engineers, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and others. That same level of federal complexity applies at the state level with the state agencies, and to a much lesser extent can also apply to tribal agencies. So it's very complex, and local governments. So the complexity of trying to bring all these together and figure out how we can actually get water to work for wildlife is complex. So I'm going to quickly talk about the Endangered Species Act. This is kind of like a little intro, but hopefully it's you'll understand why I'm diving into this later. So the purpose of the act is to conserve species in the ecosystems upon which they depend, but it's very species focused as far as the regulatory activities, not ecosystem focused, even though that is part of the purpose. The relevant regulatory sections of ESA, Section 4 is the authority to list, delist, recovery plan, not recovery implement, and designate critical habitat. We do that in coordination with the states under Section 6. And then Section 7 is kind of where a lot of activity takes place. This is what requires the federal agencies to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service on any activity that could be funding, permits, or actions where they may impact or affect endangered species. So basically we get to a place where of course it doesn't generally hit all federal agencies, but many federal activities, particularly on federal lands, go through a process of consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And what ends up happening is those projects are not allowed to jeopardize the species' existence. And there's a lot of definition behind those things. And that means they can't wipe it out. They can't be the straw that broke the camel's back that's going to wipe out that species and take it off the face of the earth. They can't jeopardize it. And they're not allowed to adversely affect the critical habitat, has kind of a similar standard and definition about, the species. And then beyond that, it requires that they avoid, minimize, and mitigate adverse effects. There's also a voluntary component that allows federal agencies to go above and beyond, and many do. But the thing to keep in mind here is you have a critically imperiled species that's already at its low, and we put it on the endangered species list because it's may go extinct. And then we say you can't jeopardize its existence. We say you have to avoid, minimize, and mitigate effects, but we don't say anywhere that we have to make things better. So becomes the real difficult spot in the ESA where we're not making progress, right? The reason people get frustrated. Section 9 is the prohibition to take. That means you're not allowed to kill, you're not allowed to shoot a wolf, you're not allowed to kill an endangered species, harm, harass, whatever. But there are occasions where we need to do that for various reasons, and that requires a permit. So Section 10 provides search and collection permits. There's also, we provide the state's permits under Section 6. Section 10 also allows, in some cases, private, but really non-federal land development permits. So where there's not a federal nexus, some federal agency that has some role, they can get a permit. In this case, I'm going to point to Washington County, who in the 90s, after desert tortoise was listed in the early 90s, were developing very quickly and needed to figure out how to mitigate and get a permit for that development. So they weren't basically, having illegal take occurring through their activities. This resulted in them developing what's called a habitat conservation plan that's done under Section 10. And their mitigation is the Red Cliffs Desert Reserve, which we all now know and enjoy as a beautiful place that offers open space values as well as a lot of conservation values for not just tortoise, but many endemic species and biodiversity. So that's kind of a real quick overview of ESA. But ESA is not perfect. As we know, it's practically resulted in a culture war in the West because of our public lands. And there's some good things about it that have worked very well and some things that are really a challenge. So the pros, it prevents extinctions. I think we show that we're able to not, have species going extinct. There's a few of those that have happened, but in general, we're successful at this. It regulates losses on some level and allows us to track that through the permitting processes. And we can develop recovery plans and promote those and coordinate those. And also, like I just mentioned, ESA listed species are considered in federal projects and to some extent in non-federal projects. And we can create that avoidance minimization measures and that mitigation to not make them go further down the hole towards extinction. We can also work proactively to prevent listing, which is another pro. The cons, however, is that recovery is costly. And as I mentioned, there's no one entity that has the responsibility or the authority to implement recovery, nor is it funded that way. It's kind of funded sporadically through different programs to federal agencies, not just Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, Forest Service, but also to the state wildlife grants, tribal wildlife grants. There's all kinds of ways. And so you have this mishmash of money coming down that we kind of have to piece together to figure out how to pay for recovery. And we all have to do that of our own volition usually through the impetus of the regulatory process. Sometimes that's Section 7A, 1A, that's voluntary. So that's how that works. That avoidance, minimization, and mitigation, this is one of the cons that I just alluded to, doesn't really get us further along towards recovery. So it becomes this Hotel California situation where species go on the list, but we're not really making progress to getting them off the list. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways we're getting around that. Also, ESA can be weaponized. That's kind of a violent word, but basically used to fight battles that really aren't about the species, but they're about either land management decisions or projects that people don't like. It might be in their backyard. It might just be a bad project, and they might have valid criticisms or a valid reason to want to have a voice in those projects or that planning. But using ESA, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, tends to undermine our ability to use it for how we want to use it, which is to recover species. Because what happens is that litigation comes with case law. So we've got case law that then defines how we have to administer the Endangered Species Act and how we define things and the decisions that we get to make. And that means that we have judges and different situations across the country that are getting pieced together that are telling us how to work through ESA. Also, the delisting process is difficult and burdensome. There's a lot of process and that goes into it that you have to do to actually get the species off the list, even when you have recovery. We can do it, and we've done it in some cases, but it's long and difficult. The previous three bullets invite politics and also creates a lot of misinformation. And this is what creates the culture war situation with wolves and grizzly bears and sagebrush. And as a result, Congress is beginning to intercede where they think this is a problem. So we see this with decisions by Congress to delist wolves or decisions by Congress to not let us work on listing of sage-grouse, that kind of thing. And I'm not putting judgment on any of those things. I'm just explaining those as pros and cons. There's good and bad and difficulty in all of it. So I'm going to get to some examples now. This is the Colorado River Basin. We've heard a lot about it in the previous lectures. These 4 fish are endangered, and a couple of them have been on the endangered species list since before we had an Endangered Species Act. So what now, 70, 60 years, something like that. The fact that these fish and the Colorado pike minnow historically could reach lengths, they say, of up to 4 to 6 feet. It was the sort of apex predator in the system. The Colorado River was a very depauperate system in the standpoint of biodiversity. Only 12 fish, I believe, that were native to the Colorado River. And of those, 8, I think, were endemic. And so compared to like the Missouri, where there's, 40, 50, 60 species of fish that are native, these species didn't have to deal with a lot of competition through their evolution, so to speak. And so with the development of water the species started to become imperiled, and with the creation of dams that stopped their migration up and down, where they previously could go from Wyoming down into Arizona, now they were sort of stuck in these smaller reaches. This created conflict as we in the upper basin states, including Utah, needed to develop that water, and it created conflict under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. Could we authorize these water developments and say that they weren't jeopardizing the species? And this conflict got litigious. It created a lot of frustration, but some good things in the end came out of it. So I'm just going to use this graphic to show that how the water accumulates downstream. And my point here is that there's the lion's share of the accumulation of water happens, I think, in the upper basin. I'm not the expert in terms of the amount of water, but from this graphic, you can see it gets at its fattest point just below Utah. So there's a lot of water that accumulates in the upper basin. And the fact that we have to deliver that water downstream to the lower basin has created some unique opportunities. So Flaming Gorge Dam, that it creates Flaming Gorge Reservoir, and Glen Canyon Dam creates Lake Powell, as well as the Aspinall units in the Gunnison, are part of this integrated system that Reclamation manages to get water to the lower basin and to provide that water to the upper basin in the ways that they need. And then, of course, there's a lot of other projects that are part of that. And I referred to the Central Utah project, that some of that water up higher over to the Wasatch Front. But the fact that we have to deliver this water from Flaming Gorge, just as an example, down to Glen Canyon Dam or Lake Powell, means that we have the opportunity to deliver that water in the river. And that's the opportunity to use that water in ways that we can support endangered fish. And Bureau of Reclamation has been a leader of the Endangered Fish Recovery Program for the Colorado River Program, as well as the state of Utah is very engaged, the state of Colorado, Wyoming, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Western Area Power Administration are all partners to this program. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means. So I'm shifting gears over to the Utah Lake and the Provo River system, and the June sucker, which you've also read about recently, particularly with reference to Utah Lake and some of the projects that are being proposed there. The June sucker, an endemic, again, only found in Utah Lake, was down to a few hundred in the late 80s or mid 80s, and was listed as endangered, I think, in 89. And of course, that's right on the cusp of Central Utah Project sort of coming to completion. There's still another 10, 15 years of work that had to be done, but right at the point where Central Utah Project was getting completed. And a lot of complexity. So you can see in the gray orbs on the right, that's bringing water from the Colorado system over to the Wasatch Front via the systems in Strawberry and Starvation through pipelines and reservoirs, and down through Diamond Fork and into Spanish Fork into Utah Lake. Utah Lake then serves as a central, these are my own words, central sort of operating reservoir that distributes, that we can then treat and distribute that water in different ways downstream. Similarly, in the Provo, we have the upper Provo draining off the Uintas on the south side through Jordanelle and Deer Creek, which is actually not a CUP project, but does then interrelated to these projects, and then moves down through the Provo. So the challenge here was, what can we do? Again, conflict, litigation. This water use is jeopardizing this species' existence, and there was a lot of conflict in the 90s and threats of litigation and other problems. And so the partners in this case, federal and local, the Central Utah Water Conservancy District, the state of Utah, the Central Utah Project Completion Act Office, the Bureau of Reclamation, and other entities, including environmental community, stepped up and said, let's work together and figure this out. So I'm going to dive into, that's not a lot of information on the administration of these programs, but I wanted to set that stage. And again, this is Section 7 based issues in the Endangered Species Act. So this is just one part of what that recovery program might do. It's not everything. They deal with a lot of issues, including habitat, non-native fish, genetic integrity, things like that. But in this case, since we're talking about water and mainly water moving downstream, I'm going to talk about this part of the June sucker recovery program, where we had, this is a hydrograph. So this is how water it comes through the system and during a water year. And you can see the runoff is the peaks that's happening there from, like, say, mid-April into June. And, in this case, we're looking at the Provo River and data from different places, but this could be different years, right? So each year it's going to look a little different. One year you might have a big peak or a double peak that goes way up. One year we have a smaller snowpack, you're going to see a lower peak. But this is natural variability, although some of these hydrographs are not entirely natural because there are some dam effects there, but this is sort of generally what we see. So Chris Kelleher, who is the director of recovery programs in the state of Utah at the time, was the June sucker biologist or the recovery program lead. And he developed a pretty simple but really elegant model of how we can try to manage for targeted flows based on the water year. So, modeling dry year, moderate years, and wet years. And the purpose was to achieve different things in the river. So you might, at some point, just want to achieve the ability for the fish to be able to get upstream. So that might be lower water year needs. At a higher water year, you might be looking for channel forming flows or habitat maintenance flows. So this kind of is what that then looks like. And these we aren't absolute numbers, and we don't hit them every year, but it's been a great model that we've been working on for about 20 years collaboratively with all the partners I mentioned. And huge shout out to Central Utah Water Conservancy District, the Bureau of Reclamation, and Department of Interior Central Utah Project offices for Utah Reclamation Mitigation Conservation Commission and the state of Utah for making this happen. It wouldn't happen without everyone playing a big part. Another program I'm not going to go into depth on is the Virgin River program in Washington County. We have two listed fish, two endangered fish in the Virgin River, and one fish. So the two listed fish are the woundfin and the Virgin River chub. The woundfin is just a very small fish that only gets to be, a few inches, maybe 3 and 4 inches long. The virgin spined listed, but has been petitioned for listed, 3 or 4 times in the last 30 years. And there's a conservation agreement, which is more of a voluntary agreement that we all work around, that the state leads, since it's not a listed species, that has allowed us to do a lot of these same activities. And we work on the recovery of all these fish, as well as a couple birds, under this Virgin River Recovery Program. Same thing, a lot of partners. Big shout out to Washington County Water Conservancy District, because they play a huge role and have contributed substantial resources from a very small county with limited private lands to this program, and the state of Utah, who also equally contributes funding, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. We also have BLM, the Park Service, and Nature Conservancy as participants, and many other partners who aren't directly involved, but play a role. So just in conclusion of those examples, recovery programs and partnerships, these are Section 7 based, the examples I've given, but they could be Section 10 based as well, meaning not necessarily a federal nexus. A little more challenging, but that has happened in some cases. So these are formal agreements among these agencies and partners to fund and implement recovery. So we're not in this static place where we're just preventing things from getting worse. We're actually trying to make things get better. And at the same time, allowing for that water development to continue as long as it's not jeopardizing. And it shouldn't be, because one of the requirements of the program is that we're making sufficient progress towards recovery. And this has been proven out in the June Sucker Recovery Program, where we've been able to downlist from threatened to endangered 2 years ago, after 20 plus years of really successful work and getting the species from just a few hundred up to several thousand, with recruitment happening in the system naturally. Still some barriers to overcome. URMCC working on the Delta, and Bureau of Reclamation and DOI CUPCO working on the Provo River Delta Restoration Project, which if you haven't seen, stop by and take a look. That's really interesting and will be a great addition to that system. As well as some issues with non-native fish that we're dealing with, but we're on our way to maybe 10 years, if things go really well, delisting this species. Oops. So now I'm going to shift gears to the Great Salt Lake to wrap this up. No listed species here. We've all been reading and hearing a lot about it. Great Salt Lake is a closed basin. Water drains from the Uintas, from the south, the north, and the west into the Great Salt Lake. And ecologically driven really by salinity, and water volume affects the salinity, right? So the more water that is developed, and this isn't anything anyone doesn't know, but the more water that's developed upstream where it's diverted, and the more efficient we get at not wasting that water, the less water is going to reach the lake, meaning the higher salinity. And let's talk about how the system works. So at the top left is historic data of water of the Great Salt Lake lake levels. And you can see it naturally fluctuates. It's a naturally fluctuating system. So from the 1850s, we're coming off of a dry period in the early 1800s, getting into more of a wet period in the late 1800s. And it's kind of a big, broad peak there. Then we get to a low, drier period in the early 1900s, then another wet period, slightly lower, slightly more condensed, then another dry period, then another wet period, even smaller, more condensed, down to the record low in the early 60s. And the reason these peaks are getting smaller and closer together is there may be some naturalness to that. So, but it also has to do with the fact that we're taking more water out through this time period. And that means there's less of a buffer for that natural variability in the system. Then we get to some really high waters in the mid 80s, the big powder years, if you were here and skied at that time. And when, the Colorado River flooding and the big flows there, and we had record highs. Since that time, we've been on that trajectory downward again, smaller peaks closer together down to where we are today, which is acute. And on the right, upper right is salinity. This is an annual cycle, but it just kind of shows, again, how salinity is impacted by water volume. So a little about the ecology. Check the time. I'll finish up here in a second. Very simple ecosystem, but very big and important. We've got basically two forms of two species that kind of support the food base: brine shrimp, which lives out its life cycle in the water, and then brine fly, which has a aquatic and then a terrestrial part of its life cycle. And these are the main food base. There's also other biota, but microbial biota in Great Salt Lake, but no fish, too salty. So this means the brine fly and the brine shrimp are the main food base. So I want to talk just real quick, orient us to how bird migration works. And this is how we think about bird migration. We categorize them as flyways. And these are large bird corridors that are continental and even hemispheric. So Great Salt Lake is in the Pacific Flyway. It's estimated that I've heard the number, something like 25% of the Pacific Flyway birds move through Great Salt Lake, 10 million birds representing 338 species. I'm not a bird expert, but these are some great facts to look at. And so you can see some of these really important, the only staging area for marbled godwit, one of the two largest staging populations for eared grebe, and sometimes more than half the continental population, up to 75% of the Western tundra population at certain times. So it's a pretty simple system, but the solution is really complicated, right? We can manage for base tributary flows or somehow get water downstream to target some lake levels. We need to support conditions of salinity. They're going to allow that ecosystem to be sustained, and for that wetland habitat, wetted shoreline habitat that the birds use. And we could do this adaptively. It doesn't always need to be a big year. It doesn't need to be the same every year, but it needs to not hit rock bottom to the point where it's going to collapse. And the reason this sounds easy but isn't is because there's no one big water manager other than the state of Utah. And so I've been very excited and happy to Governor Cox and his administration and Director Joel Ferry focus so much, as well as even Senator Romney and others in the state legislature, working on ways to help solve this problem. I realize it's not always intended for the ecological reasons. There's economic reasons and human health reasons as well, but it's really good to see. And so in conclusion, if we're managing water and we choose to steward only for human use, and if we continue to exclude other values or secondary uses as non-beneficial uses, and if we can't find a way to work together collaboratively instead of pointing fingers at who's the good guy and who's the bad guy and which use is better than another, then we will lose wildlife populations. It's just a fact. Species to extinction. It could be game or non-game. We'll see more ESA listings, more petitions, more litigation, more cost to everyone, more complexity, which we don't want to see. And probably the most important thing is our lives and our children's lives will be materially absent of this natural, incredible ecosystem and the wildlife. And ecological collapse is imminent on some level if we can't find a way to balance consumptive and non-consumptive uses. The solution is a collective vision for this landscape, sharing those values and collaborating, creative problem solving, and consideration for all the uses, not just the legally defined beneficial uses. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening to give us a sense of the interplay between science and law and policy, the role of the Endangered Species Act, how that factors into our aquatic resources, et cetera. And we really appreciate that, Yvette. Let me mention to our audience that the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen will enable you to pose questions, and we'll work through those questions now. Let me just start by this first question. Asks how you, Yvette, would respond to someone who discounts conservation, who argues that virtually all of the saved water that you mentioned is just redirected to accelerated growth and development in the state of Utah?
Really good question. And it happens all the time to all of us, not just in Fish and Wildlife Service, but in all of us working on these issues on both sides. I'm a firm believer of collaboration. I think we have to get to know our partners on both sides of whatever issue we're talking about, all sides, because there's usually more than two. And understand where it really comes down to values, what those values are. And usually when you get to the bottom of that, there's some shared values there. it's not always a shared answer, but there's shared values, and you have to build that trust in order to move forward. And that's what was done through the decades of work on these recovery programs. Of course, there was ESA at its back, which helped, but we're starting to see that collaboration being the answer more so than, in my opinion, litigation.
Could you elaborate just a little bit more on the level of both federal and state collaboration on some of the endangered species programs that you mentioned regarding the fish species and habitat, et cetera?
Sure. And, as we know, wildlife jurisdiction is primarily that of the states in our country. That's the way it works. Federal agencies sometimes have roles. In the case of Fish and Wildlife Service, we have a role when they're endangered. We also have a role when we have a wildlife refuge. So there's situations like that where some federal agencies may have a role in wildlife management, but the state has the main authority. And the way I think about it, in order to get to recovery, the states have to kind of have a plan, right? They have to know how they're going to manage these species into the future. So these culture wars aren't really helping. In Utah, we're fortunate that we have a really good relationship with the state. The state of Utah is very proactive. They have excellent professional staff. We still get into sometimes situations where, they're conflicting and competing purposes, but we work really well together, which is why we have some great success with these programs. But it's difficult, and we're all underfunded, including the state of Utah. So very collaborative, I would say, in my opinion, in my experience of working in Utah for 30 years. I appreciate my state of Utah Division of Wildlife and other Department of Natural Resource partners all the time. So great work. I don't know if I answered the question.
Well, let me build on that just another step. If you're familiar with this, are there some specific laws and policies that the state has that help to, in the first place, avoid listing, and in the second place, complement what you're doing, or the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing under the Endangered Species Act to promote recovery?
It's like I mentioned in one of the slides, it's a mix of things, right? But the state of Utah does have the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund, which is administered. The state legislature provides that and has provided that for 20 years, I believe. And that funding goes to preventing species listing, as well as helping to get species off the list. And it's been very significant, and it's not the case in every state. There's also state wildlife grants, and the Watershed Restoration Initiative is a program that the state of Utah runs, which allows us to all contribute funding into kind of, because with these many pots of money coming down, it's really hard to have a strategic process to move forward when you don't know what your funding is. So programs like Watershed Restoration Initiative allow us to kind of pool our funding and achieve some strategic outcomes. That has a very broad application. It's not always about endangered species, but I think the Endangered Species Mitigation Fund activities are getting rolled into that. It's also about restoration post-fire and some other things like that.
Right. Well, that's helpful to be aware of some of those programs. And related to that, at the end, you got into the migratory bird usage of the Great Salt Lake area and the wetlands and everything. Does the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act provide some level of protection that would come into play as the lake's level fluctuates, et cetera, based on your experience or knowledge?
Yeah, Migratory Bird Treaty Act does have a permitting process, but it's very specific to certain kinds of activities where you have birds dying due to a project activity, like wind has to get permitted, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or things like that. It gives us, so it's not as strong as Endangered Species Act in terms of the regulatory teeth and the ability to apply it in these kinds of situations. There's not as much regulation. In some ways, that's good, but it does give us the opportunity to get involved under our responsibilities for those trust resources, those migratory bird populations, but not as much in the way of teeth and permitting that we would be able to sort of jump in and point at any one user and say, you're killing birds, right?
Right. Okay. You've got a series of questions about some of water use for both municipal and agricultural excuse me, purposes. Are golf courses considered green spaces?
That's kind of a general term I was using. There's a whole range of value in green spaces. Obviously golf courses, are probably at the low end of the conservation value there. They're very monoculture. But there are other places like along the Jordan River, the restoration that's a wild, an urban wildland area that has a lot of high conservation value, not as much as connected to big contiguous wildlands, but there's some there. So it's a whole scale, going down to like a manicured front lawn being not very useful, but you get birds and animals that come into your yard, mostly those habituated animals that like to follow people around. But it's not really solving our biodiversity and big picture landscape conservation problem. It still helps though. The point is we can get very efficient to the point where we have no green space. We could do that. But is that the world we want to live in?
Okay. You're thanked for emphasizing collaborative solutions by one of our audience participants. Question of, do you have a sense of how much the declining Great Salt Lake levels will impact the surrounding wetlands and bird populations?
I mean, there's a lot of people that know a lot more than I do. But I think the general sense out there, Audubon has been very involved, Nature Conservancy, the state of Utah, as some excellent people have worked on this for decades. We know that bird populations, there's a good chance that with their habitat being interrupted and the food base being interrupted, that it's going to affect them. I can't speak to any kind of modeling or specific science, but I think some of that has been done. So I'd look to the other professionals. If anyone wants to reach out to me, I'd be happy to direct them to the right people.
Sure. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. We've got a question about dueling beneficial uses. How do we comparatively value or prioritize water recycling and reuse that involves removing in-stream sources that otherwise would have supported wildlife habitat and maintenance flows?
Yeah, it's complex. And so, we're dealing with this a lot in the Virgin River. I mean, in some ways, the Virgin River being not completely dependent on snowpack, but has sort of flashiness to it. And it has a lot of drainages that are intermittent, so they don't sustain year-round wildlife, aquatic species necessarily. There's opportunities to create flexibility through some of the plumbing. Bottom line comes down to that picture I had on my last slide of a cup with lots of straws in it. If all those straws reach to the bottom, we're all going to hit the wall. If there's a space at the bottom that those straws don't reach to, they're still going to hit a wall, but we're going to be able to maintain those other uses that are considered non-beneficial uses. And I think that will make all our lives better. The other thing that I would say in comment to one of the earlier questions, I think we're learning over the last 100 years of the evolution of conservation biology as a discipline that we are very dependent on these ecological systems, and they're very interrelated, interconnected systems. So seeing species decline, that doesn't mean we as humans are headed for an apocalypse, but it's a warning bell, right? These same natural resources that wildlife are using are the ones that we depend on. And so we're seeing this now with Great Salt Lake. And so, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think we don't need a lot of these species. This is the system that sustains the resources that we depend on.
That's certainly a sobering thought. Next question, what's the projected additional water from agriculture that might be needed to preserve wildlife refuges? I assume this is a reference to the Bear River Wildlife Refuge.
And I would definitely direct folks to my colleague, Erin Holmes, who's the project leader at the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. But the challenge there, agriculture is not bad. And I think water uses in agriculture haven't substantially changed. But if we want to make water use more efficient for agriculture, we have to decide what we're going to do with that saved water. Do we just want to, and this is hard because these are big economic questions, right? Do we want to just build more houses and so that water doesn't get to its destination? Or do we want to allow for some of that water to reach its downstream destination and support that ecosystem and allow for future development? It's very complex, but I think we can do it. We have to, really, we have no choice.
Yeah. Is there a listing of local wildlife and water resource collaborative research in Utah that might be available to the public and that the public might participate in some of these processes?
Well, I certainly there's a lot of information get found at those websites, and I'm assuming you'll be able to access those links from a slideshow or something that you'll share. The state of Utah has a pretty extensive library through various divisions. I mean, I don't know that there's any one place. A way to participate is, you can get involved either by reaching out to one of either state, federal, local partners. You can also get on the website, read about it, and try to understand. Most of them have some component of interacting with the public at large, not just the local government. But there's no one spot, I would say, to get you that, but there's a lot of places to find it. So I don't know, there might be, I don't know if I answered that very clearly, but I'd be happy to talk about it more if someone wants to reach out to me.
Okay. Another question asked about the potential impact of a proposed law that would prohibit water reuse within the Great Salt Lake Basin.
I mean, my opinion, is that what you're asking? Like,
what would be the potential impact of such a law if it were adopted that would prohibit reuse within the basin?
I mean, honestly, our laws serve a purpose, but the more we can collaboratively decide what we want to plan for and make it happen without regulations add cost, bureaucracy, complexity, and they don't always solve the problem that we think they're going to solve. We think we're drawing a line, and you're only going to, I say this a lot, but you're only going to regulate people into a certain level of submission. They're never going to go above and beyond and care about what they're doing by regulation. You have to work with people and develop those relationships and find out where you share values in order for that to become integrated into their own stewardship, which is how we get lasting conservation. So there are laws that are necessary. We certainly need to look at our water laws and figure out how to change those and make those help us instead of hurt us as we learn more about what we want to protect into the future. But creating laws that just sort of across the board ban this and that, I mean, there may be situations where it makes a lot of sense to reuse water. That's not necessarily bad. It's what you do with that reused water that's really critical.
Right. That's helpful. Well, this next question ties back into that notion of working collaboratively versus the role of the law in enforcing, for example, senior water rights in the absence of a law or in the absence of potential litigation. Would senior water rights holders come to the table to collaborate with on some of these water, wildlife, fish issues?
I'm not sure. And there's, yeah, go ahead.
And without the Endangered Species Act backing up some of the regulatory type initiatives or collaborative initiatives, would we make the same level of progress?
I'm not sure. We're evolving as a society, right? And so, and the state plays a big role in leadership on this, right? So we can fight it and make it a state versus fed thing, or we can own it and figure out how to lead the way to what we want our landscapes to look like.
Okay, that is helpful. With that, let me thank you, Yvette, again for joining us, sharing your insights on water and wildlife. Let me thank our audience for joining us today. Let me mention that although this concludes our four-part water law and policy series, that this presentation and the prior three will be available on the College of Law website, at YouTube website, I should add. Let me also mention on March 16th and 17th, the Stegner Center will host its 28th annual symposium on the future of the Great Salt Lake, and that registration is open at the Wallace Stegner Center website under the College of Law. And with that, let me thank everyone again for joining us today. Wish you well in Grand Teton National Park. We're envious of your setting there. And hopefully we'll see everyone again at the symposium or at the post-symposium Stegner Center Green Bag programs. Thank you again for joining us.